One of the most common misconceptions about Native Americans is that they don't pay taxes. In reality, most Native individuals pay federal income tax just like any other U.S. citizen. However, some tribal governments and businesses operate under tax exemptions due to tribal sovereignty. This raises a larger question. Should Native Americans be completely tax-exempt nationwide, or would that create more problems than solutions? Supporters of nationwide tax exemptions argue that Native nations have already paid their debts through stolen land, broken treaties, and centuries of systemic oppression. The U.S. government has failed to uphold its treaty obligations, often underfunding Native health care, education, and infrastructure. As indigenous economist Tara Houska states, if the U.S. honored its original agreements, tribes wouldn't need to rely on federal programs or tax exemptions to survive. Tribal sovereignty is another key factor. Since Native nations are legally considered separate governments, many argue they should have full control over their tax policies, free from federal and state interference. Currently, some tribal businesses on reservations are exempt from state taxes, but this varies depending on local agreement. Expanding tax exemptions could strengthen tribal economies and allow Native nations to invest in their communities without outside restrictions. Critics, however, warn that making all Native Americans tax-exempt could create economic complications. It could spark backlash from non-Native taxpayers who view exemptions as unfair, potentially undermining support for indigenous rights. Additionally, some argue that tax revenue is essential for funding public services, including those that benefit Native populations. There's also the question of whether tax exemptions alone are enough. Some Native leaders believe that focusing solely on taxes ignores deeper issues, such as land restoration, economic development, and tribal self-sufficiency. Instead of debating tax exemptions, they argue for more meaningful solutions, such as returning or increasing funding for treaty-promised services. So, should Native Americans be tax-exempt nationwide? The discussion goes beyond taxes. It's about sovereignty, justice, and the U.S. government's responsibility to honor its commitments. Perhaps the real question isn't whether Native people should be exempt, but whether they should still be forced to depend on a system that has historically worked against them. What do you think? Let's continue the conversation.